Hey,
Did you hear?
Did you hear about the new podcast? Hoy, what's it called? It's literally called Psst. What?
There's a new
There's
podcast
a
out
new
right now.
podcast?
It's from Fil-CHA.
Filipinx AO sharing stories together, as in the Psst podcast.
All right, so welcome back everyone to another episode of the Filipinx AO Sharing Stories Together or PSST podcast. Today is June 26, 2021 on the tail end of honoring Pride Month. This is episode 5, COVID-19 impacts on the Filipinx AO LGBTQIA plus community. Quick disclaimer, this information is up to date as of today's recording live stream on June 26, 2021. But due to the circumstances surrounding COVID-19, information may have changed by the time you view this episode. I do also want to offer a content warning that some of the conversations may include sensitive topics such as violence against the queer and trans community. And we also would like to acknowledge our presence on Indigenous lands in which we stand. We express our gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and we honor the Indigenous peoples who have been living and working on this land since time immemorial. It's important that we understand the long-standing history that has brought us to reside on these lands and to seek to understand our place within that history. With that being said, we also have closed captions on Zoom and Facebook, so please check the chat for those options. All right, so let me first introduce myself. So I am Dr. Bradley Ramos, pronouns he, him, his, and I'm part of Fil-CHA. What is Fil-CHA? Well, the goal of the Filipinx AO Community Health Association, or Fil-CHA, formerly known as the Filipinx AO COVID-19 Resource and Response Team, is to address the health disparities within the Filipinx AO community and provide policy recommendations and resources surrounding the needs of the community. We also aspire to serve as a network for the Filipinx AO community through collaboration between Filipinx AO scholars, community organizers, leaders, researchers, social workers, public health advocates and professionals, clinicians, and media. So a little bit about myself. I'm currently residing on Tongva land in Los Angeles County, where I work as a clinical pharmacist. In addition to being a pharmacist, I am also a community health advocate with Kapwa Health Collective in the San Francisco Bay Area, and of course, Fil-CHA. While I don't identify as part of the LGBTQI plus community, I will be a guest and a facilitator in this space, and I'm joined by my co-host, Miko. Miko?
Hi, my name is Miko. I am 24 years old. I'm a queer trans man currently residing in Muwekma Ohlone land in San Jose, California. I went to school at UC Santa Cruz for economics. I'm currently studying sociology now at Sacramento City College. Was a social worker currently looking for a job since I recently just moved, and hopefully I am going to start applying for law schools this upcoming fall. Next, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Eric Yanzon, they, them, their pronouns. Eric is a queer trans first generation immigrant from Caloocan City, Caloocan, nice, of Philippines. They are currently residing in the traditional lands of Coast, Salish, and Duwamish peoples in Seattle, Washington, and work as the program coordinator for the Office of Diversity and Equity at the University of Washington, Bothell. Eric received their Master's of Education in Student Development Administration at Seattle University in 2020 and their Bachelor of Arts in American Culture Studies and Sociology at Western Washington University in 2018. They have been involved in various Filipino American community organizations and currently serve on the leadership board for Unipro Seattle. Eric is a triple Scorpio, loves cooking, dancing, and is an inspiring writer and storyteller. Eric, why don't you tell us more about yourself?
Hi everyone. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for having me. A lot of my work has centered in higher education and working with cultural centers and working with students of color and other marginalized communities. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I'll pass it back on to Bradley.
All right, thank you, Eric. So excited to have you. But before we begin, I just want to take a minute for an acknowledgement. So a big thank you to the Association of Asian Pacific Community Health Organizations, otherwise known as AAPCHO, for making this possible. Also, this podcast was partially funded with the generous support from the Walmart Foundation. All right, so let's dive into the episode. Episode 5, COVID-19 impacts on the Filipinx AO LGBTQIA plus community is the 5th episode of the Filipinx AO Sharing Stories Together, or PSST series. surrounding COVID-19 following our pilot episode. This follows our previous episode on Filipinx AO healthcare workers' experiences during COVID-19. And this episode will consist of me and Miko as the host and our guest speaker that you just met, Eric Yanzon.
Yeah, this episode addresses the impact of COVID-19 on the Filipinx AO LGBTQIA plus community. The views and stories shared within this episode are reflective of our own experiences and opinions and are not intended to represent the entirety of the LGBTQIA plus community. Any content provided within this episode is based on our own lived experiences and is not intended to malign any religious groups, organizations, or individuals. While what's shared in this episode may be individual to our own stories, we do hope to find a common thread of the experiences within the Filipinx AO LGBTQIA plus community. Throughout this episode, we will be talking about shared patterns and experiences within this community, as well as the significance of the XAO in the Filipinx AO effects of the COVID-19 on the LGBTQIA plus community, and how to be a supportive / a good ally and what resources are available for us and y'all.
Yes, I also want to acknowledge that within Fil-CHA, we also have the Mental Health Committee, whose goal is to improve the mental health and well-being of the Filipinx AO community through collaborations with individuals, communities, and organizations from multiple sectors focused on behavioral health. All right, it's time to dive into our first topic. Miko, start us off.
Well, given that this is the LGBTQIA plus episode, I think it would be really fair for Bradley to explain to us first, why does Fil-CHA use XAO?
Right, so Fil-CHA, we do use XAO, and the goal of that, given our work in health equity, we strive to be as inclusive as possible, but I can let Eric take the mic from here.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think it's really important to really kind of unpack, right, like all the letters, the alphabet letters that are in the word Filipinx AO, and then also first even, right, like having discussion about like why we use P instead of F. And the language, or a lot of this is really rooted in language and like our history of colonialism. And the word XAO, or specifically the word X, is really have started within the Filipino diaspora to include a lot of folks within or outside of the binary. And so the X kind of removes that because, right, our language, while and there's a lot of discourse happening in terms of the Filipino language being a gender neutral term, right? Because a lot of our pronouns will have sha, which can be both he or she or they, and so but on the other hand, the word Filipino and Filipina can still be interchangeably and is inherently gendered, and we still have a lot of different terms that are ultimately gendered and don't have any equivalent for a gender inclusive term like tito, tita, or ate, kuya, and stuff like that. And so and so there's a lot of nuances and conflicts within like who uses this word. And from a lot of what I've heard within this discourse, especially folks who live in the Philippines or grew up in the Philippines, who are not used to the term X, and claiming that X is not part of the Filipino language or our alphabet, and that this is very much like a US or a North American centric type of term. But I think, right, like we're using this as an opportunity to really be as inclusive as possible within in this community. And I think, right, like with languages and cultures, they continue to evolve and change, and we have to follow that and we have to evolve with it, right? And I think a lot of this conversation also really reminds me of what happened this year with Women's History Month. Specifically, back in March, there was a lot of discourse regarding using the word X in Women X, and there's a lot of history that I honestly did not even know that existed, right? Because we I feel like a society, we just again follow the terms and what is the most inclusive, but again, language continuously changed, and the use of X in women, right, was supposed to include women, and again to challenge the binary. But then a lot of the discourse that's happening is that why aren't we treating trans women as women, period. And so, right, and like, why do we need to having X to exclude them in that conversation, right? And so, and inherently, right, if you're a woman, then like you identify as a woman. And so, right, like, and if we are intentionally including conversations to include non-binary individuals, gender fluid individuals, then like we need to just include them in the description, right? Like it doesn't matter that we like are using just Filipinx or and like if we're really trying to include everyone, then use all those terms. Do Filipinx, Filipina, Filipino, to do that, right? Like, and if our conversation like is really centering those in the margins, and then like then we also need to name that, like who is included in that conversation, because a lot of the times there's a lot of programs that are like, oh yeah, this is like a women of color or like women X included space, but then like how are trans individuals, queer individuals included in that, right? And then like, do you actually mean that you're just including like with depending on your topic, are you including people who have uteruses and like people who have periods? Is that the conversation that you're having, or are you talking just about just like non-male individuals or non-cis individuals, right? So I feel like there's really a lot of again nuances in this conversation. And yeah, and I think that really relates to this, and I'm really glad that Fil-CHA is choosing to include all of that within this podcast and within their organization. And yeah.
Great. Eric, I want to chime in because you mentioned how language evolves, and there's a lot of discussions about this. And I was hoping you can kind of dive a little bit into why this language is important in building your identity and really making you feel safe in your skin, and which I think is really important. But yeah, could you talk a little bit about how like it's important, to rephrase my question, why this language is important for us to consider in making ourselves feel safe, as well as making the folks around us feel safe as well.
Yeah. And I think, right, like historically, like as you mentioned, as like language changes and evolves, and like especially now when we're in a generation where our younger generation is like having the ability to really have the language, right, with accessibility of like how our technology has evolved, and like that language of like like I can feel seen when we use the word X or Filipinx, and like as a non-binary individual, and like how like folks identify with that, right? And like also, right, like naming that a lot of Filipino organizations through history has excluded a lot of trans people, queer people, and I think even looking back at our history, pre-colonially in the Philippines, a lot of trans individuals are like leaders in history, right? And a lot of those history has been erased of like what that looks like, right? And then again, like with colonialism and imperialism, and with like Spanish and American influence, right? Like that's really changed, and like our perception of like what is gender, and what is Filipino, right? And then like which includes many different identities and cultures, and so
Yeah. Okay. As a trans individual myself who was also born in the Philippines, I know Eric, you are the same. Do you feel like, just in terms of, you were talking about the diaspora, do you think that maybe this could be the change that like Filipino Americans can lead and bring it to the Philippines? Because I know for me, and specifically, if I were still in the Philippines, there's no way in hell I would even have the knowledge or the words or just be able to realize that I am trans. This was a privilege that I was able to get by my parents moving me to America. So do you think that this could translate over to the Philippines maybe down the line?
I mean, honestly, I don't know, right? Because I feel like within me, as well, with my personal lived experiences, I'm not completely out to the rest of my, extended family, whether that's here or in the Philippines. And so that can be a really tricky conversation, especially, right? Like as we unpack, our like generational trauma, and like a lot of our, like the our sense of hiya in terms of like respecting our elders and how to have those conversations. So that in itself can be a lot, right? But also I think I also want to acknowledge this thing that I heard from Gina Rosero, which is a trans Filipino model who was also an immigrant from the Philippines. And she talked about how, you know, queer folks and like LGBTQI plus community are recognized, and the difference between the Philippines and the US. Because in the Philippines, right, there's trans people on TV, and a lot of it might be like comedic, and like they're recognized everywhere, right? Like they're very much like known within the families and stuff like that. But then politically, they're not recognized at all. They don't have any rights or privileges that allow them for them to do that. But then here in the US, there might be like, you know, there might have more like political recognition in terms of, right, like their gender and sexuality. But like socially, we're still not there of like recognizing, and like again, when we see it in the media and stuff like that. And so I think I like think about that a lot in terms of the discourse of like how, you know, queer folks navigate themselves like within the US and the Philippines. And like, you know, the access to hormones and transitioning in the US is obviously much easier here. And then the complication of like the Philippines being you know, a predominantly Catholic country definitely adds to that nuance of conversation of like how we view gender and sexuality, and like who we're supposed to love, and like all of that stuff. And so I think, yes, I think it's definitely starting a conversation of like, right, like how we can, you know, be more inclusive of like, you know, using this. But I think it's going to take generations and generations for us to truly be able to do that. And also like, while you're right, like a lot of this conversation has started within the Philippine diaspora, like also recognizing the power dynamics within that, right, like of how like a lot of these conversations can be very elitist of like, oh, of who has access to this language of like, oh yeah, no, we're using Pilipinx, and like I know people in the, and like, you know, in this like cancel culture part of that conversation of like, oh yeah, and I think it really just depends, right, like again, like our intentionality of like who we're including and who we're centering in the conversations we're having. And yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I loved how you mentioned a lot about, you know, maybe not having access to certain things. You included even things like hormone therapy and things like that. And me as a pharmacist, I've definitely seen delays in care during COVID-19, and that, you know, affects different communities differently. So I want to know, you know, how has, you know, and you may frame this however you want, but with the question, how has the Filipinx AO community, LGBTQIA plus community been affected by COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, right? Like it's been like the pandemic has hit us in many different ways. Different communities has been affected from it differently. But I know at the beginning of the pandemic, right, like when a lot of like places were shut down, many resources were stopped, and that include again gender affirming surgeries. I had a lot of friends who they already had their appointment going, you know, in the, you know, beginning of like 2020, like of their and they had to do that because, right, it's like non-essential type of surgery, quote unquote, and a lot of hormones and just like access to care, and then also like support systems, right? And a lot of the times, like a lot of LGBTQI plus community have to find their community underground, and to like not be able to, you know, be in community with others, and like access to that really stops that. And I think on top of that, right, like with in terms of community, a lot of LGBTQ IA plus youth, as they transitioned into like remote learning and online school, and like a lot of them having to like move back home, where they might not be as open in, you know, their identity as a queer person, and like navigating that in like an online school of like what that looks like while their parents are like, you know, in the background or listening, and like, you know, having they like not being able to be their full authentic selves. I think for me, where I've found a lot of refuge as a queer individual growing up was always through school. I feel like, you know, I feel like that's kind of like why my trajectory led me into higher education as well. And I think especially in my college journey is where I really had the journey and privilege of exploration, my own identity, and again the access to language about like who I am, and I'm like still trying to figure that out. And so again, like for a lot of LGBTQI plus youth who are experiencing that, like through online school, that could be complicated. And then also just even the option of like having to move back home and like choosing, like your own mental health, right, and or like your like own financial, because right, like COVID-19 also presented a lot of financial struggles for, in terms of like a lot of like employment opportunities also have stopped. And so right, like and like a lot of like communities, especially like sex workers, and different, a lot of those things had to be like reimagined what that looks like. And so for a lot of the queer community, like figuring out other creative ways to be able to like support themselves, and again like living with family and the different dynamics that shows in terms of like instability with housing as well. Trans youth are the, like in terms of like statistics, are the most like homeless, right? And so I think that all ties into like a lot of the different experiences that queer folks are experiencing throughout this pandemic, and it continues to do that and to be a challenge, even as we are transitioning into this like new normal of what life looks like, right?
No, yeah, I feel like a lot of folks don't like really recognize how detrimental it truly is to one's mental health, to really just have to like conceal who you are, or to like live in like a housing situation where that your parents will not accept you for you. And that's honestly like a really unfortunate reality for a lot of Filipino American, like just Filipinos in general. And I worked with youth experiencing homelessness, and specifically with LGBTQI youth. And they, as a trans man, like when I was coming out myself, because I had a lot of trans clients who were kicked out of their homes. So it was really just like me coming out was such a hard process on my own mental health, because I didn't know how my parents were going to take it, and I, as a social worker, saw the worst of the worst where like people were kicked out. So I know that like my parents loved me, but also just like, I know that there is that possibility where I could get kicked out of my home, I could lose my housing. So a lot of folks who have luckily I have parents who were super accepting of it as far as they can, because they are very traditional and Catholic, but it's really just the hardship of having to pick either like yourself and your identity or your housing stability or your home. And you're just like, yeah, people really don't realize like it's really hard. It's a struggle that a lot of people don't know.
Yeah, and I think we were having this conversation in terms of, right, like in Filipino families, it's such an expectation to again like move back home, and like always, like family values is like one of our biggest values. And so, but for a lot of Filipino trans folks, they don't have that option of moving back home and choosing to, again like choosing their mental health or their own stability, right? And so that's really present within our community.
What do you think are like, okay, I lost my train of thought here, but I had a good question going. Bradley, do you have anything while I'm like trying to get my, because I had a good question, dang it.
Yeah, and I know there's a huge, spectrum of like the effects that, could happen during COVID-19. You talked a lot about like housing instability, but that also could have brought folks away from their usual support. You mentioned how school had to go from online learning to, or go from in-person to online learning. And you mentioned that college may have been like a really great place for you to like find support and friends. How has that been a challenge for you, Eric? Or how could you relate to that experience?
Yeah, and like I said, I mean, like I was in the middle of like my grad school experience when the pandemic started. So I graduated in 2020. But I think, right, like just like relating to that conversation again of like college have like being the space of like where I was able to like explore my own gender and sexual identity. Right. And like imagining too, like how that looks like in like again, like not being able to be, part of organizations and clubs that like center those experiences that are, again, like, I mean, like a lot of them, also translated to virtual communities, but it's truly not the same. And especially, on top of that 2020 being like a very wild year in terms of what was happening in our country and all the social unrest and like the presidential election that happened. And like, again, right, like in the ways we are like processing all of the trauma that we're experiencing. And then even currently, right, like a lot of the legislation against trans youth that are happening in different states in the country. And it's absurd that, you know, like we're still, you know, going backwards in history of like what that looks like. And so I think, you know, there's a lot to unpack there. And I think another thing that I just thought about in terms of like, you know, the pandemic affecting this, you know, like the LGBTQI plus community, and like remembering that like when the AIDS pandemic happened in the 80s, right? Like the country did not give a crap about like what, like, you know, like the gay community was experiencing. They literally let us die, right? And like, and now that, right, like it's affecting like everyone, right? Like in our perception of like care and access, and like, you know, we were so, I mean, right, like we already have the, like a better technology to figure out, like, you know, with the vaccines and stuff. But I think, you know, for a lot of queer folks, they're, you know, we're having to relive that trauma of what it looks like for, like, you know, our communities to be dying and not be supported. And there's still a lot of, you know, spaces, like we saw it happen with COVID, right? Like a lot of, like, it was pushed into different Black and brown communities because they're the ones who don't have access to care. We see that happening right now in, like, you know, India still has very high cases of that. And so, you know, like thinking about, you know, like the healthcare system and like who we're centering in that conversation, and that like it always gets pushed into like with marginalized communities, right? And then like especially when it's just with the AIDS pandemic, when that happened, right? Like it was just that, and then like no one cared. And so I think that's the other thing, and like having to relive that trauma and what that looks like has been really eye-opening and rough.
I think, Bradley, you can touch upon it, and Eric, I think you can too, but as a pharmacist, I know because of the AIDS epidemic, there has been a lot of mistrust within the LGBTQ community to like just the medical scene. I don't, like, in general, have you seen, like, and I've seen that within like online forums of just like people within the community who refuse to get the vaccine because they don't trust it, because of all the mistrust from the history of, you know, just malpractice towards the LGBTQ community. Do you think, have you seen any of that as a pharmacist, or Eric, have you like seen any of that within your own personal experience, I guess?
Yeah, I can touch on a little bit. So definitely, you know, as a healthcare worker and working with underserved communities in LA County, I've seen how, you know, delays in care can be really frustrating for patients. And that, so it may not necessarily be a conversation about trusting the healthcare system, but there have been so many ways, and I love that you brought up history because it's so important, in ways that communities have historically been left out or forgotten, or delays in care, or just have not been prioritized. And so it just adds to this long history of kind of not being cared for in the ways that they were hoping for by the healthcare system in general. And so, you know, I think, you know, having access and acknowledging that long history of, you know, of inequity and, you know, really systemic racism that, you know, systemic racism and systemic oppression for marginalized communities in the healthcare system, I think is very important that we call out if we're ever going to fix it. But that's what I'll leave it at that. Eric, do you want to add on to anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, like, just like also in general, right? Like in how we view, like, I like within, like, I've had a lot of experiences or like doctor appointments where like, yeah, I'm still continually misgendered. And like, also like, you can't even fill out certain, like, you know, your pronouns and gender identity. And I understand that there's some, you know, biological component of like sex and like how you can be treated for your care and whatever. But like, you know, the medical industry still continues to exclude our communities within that. And that's like very real.
No, yeah, I've definitely had my own experiences of like just consistently being misgendered at a doctor's office, or having to keep reminding them to like fix the system to put in my preferred name. But they kept saying like, we can't do that. And I'm just like, I feel like technology has advanced enough for you to be able to just like put a parentheses or something. But how do you think we can like rebuild this like trust within the community? How can we, how can we build the bridge? Is that the expression for it? Because because it is definitely a divide that's very prevalent, and it makes us very apprehensive to even seek care if we know that seeking care is also at the expense of our own mental health. And yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of it too is like, right, confronting the system, right? A lot of it is like where that system is rooted from, right? And like who, again, like who has access to that care. And like it's not our job to change the system. The system needs to change itself, or we need to abolish the whole thing. And I think that's really like what it is, right? Like, and again, like also just like layers of intersectional identities. Like for me, like as a first gen person, like I like navigating like insurances and like navigating different like medical I'm still confused on like how to do all of that, on top of like just like worrying about like what I need to do to like like get access to those things, like whether that's like therapy or like access to hormones and what that looks like, and making sure that your doctor actually understands your needs and like what you want to do and accomplish, that is like autonomous to your own body and health. And so that's really, really complicated. And I feel like personally for me, I don't necessarily have like a mistrust within like the medical world, but it's like definitely a daunting experience every time like you have to deal with that, and like the financial implications of like how to like deal with that, and like just like it's a lot. And like we don't have enough resources for the community to be able to ask for like to help each other to like how do you even start, like and like again, right, like that ties into like employment privileges and stuff like that. And so there's really, really a lot to unpack there. Yeah.
I think being after going through the training that I've had in the medical field, I'm like able to like share that knowledge now, and I think it's just really building a lot of community like knowledge and community wealth and like capital in order to try to navigate these systems. But is there any other way us as like a community can support each other, especially the LGBTQI plus community who may face different challenges than other folks, and how can we do better to support and center those people in our lives?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, I think the first thing that came to mind is like, I'm really a big proponent of like mutual aid. I feel like mutual aids are the ones that like, especially within this pandemic, we've seen like a lot of communities like come together, right? And like, again, like with access to things, like financially and like, with resources, right? Like how we're thinking about that. I feel like mutual aid is really what's helped, especially for a lot of like, Black and brown trans youth and like who experiencing homelessness, and to just like have a home. A lot of the resources that have saved them have been mutual aid efforts. And so I think, right, like continuing for us to support those. And again, on top of that, right, like mutual aid is like rooted in community, and like challenging like how we view like, again, access to resources and care, and like how we view that. And so I think
For folks that may not be, I guess, familiar with mutual aid, could you maybe explain that a little bit?
Yeah, mutual aid is really about like a community bringing together resources of what they can give and what they can take. And actually, this is kind of a tangent, but like even in the Philippines, how mutual aid, I don't know if you've heard this, because like like with the pandemic and like President Duterte not doing anything to support their own people, and there was a lot of communities, specifically mothers, who started mutual aid efforts to like give food, like extra food that they have, and like the government like claiming that it's like a communist propaganda to like do that, right? Because but then like what are they doing, right? So I think mutual aid has become the alternative, the like reimagination of like what communities can do to support each other, because the system will not support us, right? The government will not support us. And so mutual aid has really been showed us that like we can like be like save ourselves and like be here for ourselves as a community. And so that's kind of like a tangent of like what mutual aid is. Yeah.
Yeah. definitely like just you emphasizing the need of like us sticking together as a community and coming together, just like not only in efforts of just like food or medicine, but as a whole. Do you feel like what can we do to kind of just like what can we do to like bridge, like be better, I guess, how can we improve the relations between just the LGBTQ community and the het community in the within Filipino culture as a whole? Because I feel like there is a lot of toxic masculinity within Filipino culture. There is a lot of just homophobia still within Filipino culture. Is there a way where we can, I guess it's not up to the LGBTQ community, huh? To like, it's not, or sorry, I just like caught myself as I'm asking that. I'm just like, oh wait, it shouldn't be up to us. Like, right? What do you think?
It's not. I mean, yeah, you're right. Right. I think, right. Like, and like, especially again, like as we live in like a world with we have access to technology, and all of that. And I think, like cis hetero folks like need to be able to like find like, do their own work. And, like there's resources out there. And then just like also just like the basic premise of like what respect looks like, and like seeing like how others like feel comfortable and like be their authentic selves. I feel like that's a lot of the things that I've been reflecting on right now, especially right like being part of different Filipino organizations, and like like choosing like what parts of myself am I really like showing to make others feel comfortable, and how much of that I'm actually my comfortable most authentic self. And so yeah, it's really, and again right like and whose job it is to like start that conversation, right? And like a lot of that emotional labor usually comes from us, and like in order to start that. And again, in a lot of spaces sometimes we don't even talk about and bring about or bring conversation to like what pronouns are, and like again like right the conversation about like what Pilipinx means and all of that. And so I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done for sure. And I think right like it starts from like showing respect and showing up for each other. Yeah.
There's definitely a big generational gap between like us as like of just a for pre-warning, I am like 24, I believe we're 25 and 26, or are we? Yeah, right. Okay, cool. I forgot which one's 25 and which one's 26, but we are all within the same age group. So there is that big divide between like how we as younger millennials versus just like the older generation of our parents versus like Gen Zers, and how we all like what do you think are the like the big divides, and what caused the like divide,
Yeah. And I think right like it, like I mentioned earlier, just like having conversation with your family members about like what gender is and pronouns and like the X and all of that, it's hard, right? And I feel like especially within the context of the Philippine or the U.S. diaspora or Philippine diaspora within the U.S. And like how a lot of our parents, especially like first generation immigrants, they moved here based off survival, right? And like a lot of them may have lived within the Marcos regime where like they were conditioned to just like stay silent, and then like like generationally, right, again like being born and raised in a predominantly Catholic country, and like how we've again view gender and sexuality in that terms, like a lot of them have been since birth to like when they like had children and been conditioned to think like, oh, this is it. And like and like again like with that framework of like hiya and like and like being bastos and like what that looks like, and like so hiya is shame and bastos is like kind of like being rude, just to explain that a little bit. And then like within our Filipino culture and like of what and like how we view that, and it's hard to like unpack those conversations. But really again I feel like a lot of the conversation in terms of like liberation and like justice really like starts from home, and right, and like and for a lot of queer trans individuals, especially within the Filipino community, like that may be hard to start, but really like a lot of it is like goes back into our own humanity, and how our like parents have like also done. And I feel like reflecting on this with in terms of like my relationship, like like with my parents. And so I technically still have not told them like everything that I'm doing, but like it's like I act like this at home, and like I like do it's not like they don't know or like they haven't heard anything. But like it's still hard to have those conversations, and it takes a lot of emotional and mental labor to do that. But I think it's also like choosing ourselves right first, of like choosing like what energy we have in order to have this conversation in what spaces, and again how much of ourselves like we're continuing to make others feel comfortable, or us making ourselves feel comfortable. And so I mean it's really really complicated for sure. And yeah.
I feel like you've already kind of started talking about this question that I want to ask, like with like conversations and bringing it home, and especially with COVID-19, I think a lot of us have been home, and it may have just being in that proximity might have forced those conversations a little bit more. But I want to ask, like, what does healing look like in our families when it comes to this, and what action steps can we all take to really start supporting and centering the LGBTQI plus folks that are close to us and around us.
Yeah, and I think like healing, I feel like really starts inwardly, personally. And so, and I think just again I think being able to like meet, especially like our parents and our older Filipino generations, and like meeting where they're at, like meeting where they can understand and like empathize with you. And again, right, like there's a lot of emotional labor attached to that. And I think just like being able, and again like also understanding the privileges that we also come from, right? And again, as like for a lot of like second generation Filipinos, and like again like people who have access to like have this language, whether that you got that through college, and like a lot of our parents might not even have that background and language to do that. And so like meeting them where they're at, and I feel like looking at it right like from the perspective of like as we learned and unlearned like all of the things that we regarding our own identity, like starting from that, right? Like starting from a conversation of like who, like, and again, like what conditions have we been put into in like for to make us think the way we do. And again, like for a lot of our parents and the older generation, a lot of that has again been rooted from colonialism and Catholicism, and being conditioned to think that way. And then also just like within the API community of like again like continuously being silenced and erased, and like again like and our parents like choosing to just not even have the conversation to begin with. And so I think that's again it's a complicated process, but it needs to happen. And yeah.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that's a process, because a lot of these conversations, it can sometimes be like walking on eggshells for a lot of different topics. And um, I'm not sure where I was going with that, but yeah, I just do want to acknowledge that a lot of these conversations do take time, and um, as with a lot of things, a lot of deeply ingrained beliefs take years to develop, and so does changing beliefs. It does take a lot of consistency and conversations. So a lot of these conversations are going to have to happen over time. And so for folks out there, like I just hope that you stay persistent, but also sustain yourself. That it's not going to, it may not change overnight, unfortunately. But yeah, I just love what you mentioned, Eric.
Oh yeah, same. And I also just wanted to like point out, like, do do you have any siblings by chance, Eric? I was just wondering.
I do, yes. I'm the youngest, so I have an older sister, an older brother.
Uh, do do they know? I'm sorry to put you on the spot. Or
No, that's okay. So they also technically don't. I have not had that conversation. I have a very complicated relationship with my siblings. And so like one of them are here, and then my brother is in the Philippines. And yeah, and I think right, like generate, like I guess I'm assuming you brought that up in terms of like intergenerationally and how we've had that
yeah,
conversation.
yeah,
And I feel
yeah.
like low key, like not. To, and I feel like my sister might be in the spectrum as well, low key. I mean, but like we haven't necessarily had that conversation of like what that looks like. And so and yeah, and I think it's again like having the language. And so like my sister graduated high school in the Philippines, and like she just kind of like went straight to like a community college. And so again, like she didn't necessarily have the same like assimilation that I had, I guess, like within like, the US culture and stuff. And so like I feel like our experiences are completely different, even though she's only 3 years older than me. And so I think like again, like that access to information and language is completely different. And I feel like even right now, like I'm still like constantly kind of challenging her in terms of like, language, especially what happened last year with like Black Lives Matter. And so like like again like slowly having those conversations and like centering, right, and like again finding ways to connect like how this experience connects to their own lived experiences, right, of like again like how we view colorism and homophobia within the Philippines and how that connects to like who we are and like what they do and the conditions that made them to think that way. And so yeah, and then again like every experience and every community is also completely different. But yeah,
these are really difficult conversations to have too, and there is no pressure or ever any rush to just come out, nor does anyone have to like owe anyone, like no one owes anyone like coming out, or like no queer person has to tell you that, but more importantly, like isn't never ever out someone, even as you're like trying to, because I have a friend who was trying to have that queer conversation with their parent, but then they ended up outing their like cousin at the same time. And I think that even just blew up even more, like even if you're having that conversation, you don't like reveal someone's sexuality to someone who doesn't like want them to know, like
yeah, and like coming out is, again, we can unpack that word too, but like I feel like that's a constant process, right? Like every new job we're in, like every new community that we're a part of, like consistently like having to come out, because again like the norm isn't that like, oh okay, like I use they them pronouns, and like choosing sometimes not to do that. And I think also the expectation is that like queer and trans people always have to like introduce their own pronouns like when others don't, and then like again that concept of like, oh, okay, there are they them, or like there are this. And so right, and like having to constantly do that, and like choosing, and like also like how like we pass as people and how people view us, and so, and like that complication of that, like okay, having to redo that, and like their perception of like who we are as a person. But like I guess Miko, let me ask you, like how has that been experienced for you, especially like with your family and like maybe your siblings? And
yeah, I actually like I came out to my siblings first, and oh shoot, am I muted? Oh wait, no, I'm not muted. Yeah, I came out to my siblings first, and they were super supportive, and I think, and I'm really grateful for that, because they were really the like my backbone of me being able to come out to my parents. And then they were the ones who had the more difficult conversations of getting them to understand, because just me doing it to them was like real, like me telling my parents or trying to educate them was really emotionally just overwhelming for me, because there was that always that constant feeling of like my parents don't get it and they're not ever going to get it. So it was really their jobs as like my siblings and as my allies to step in and fill that role that I couldn't, to try to get my parents to understand. And we've come a long way. My parents still aren't there necessarily, but we're there-ish. We're as far as we can be at the moment, and it's only like getting better.
Yeah, that reminds me, like in terms of like my own reflection, in terms of like coming out to my family, which again I still haven't done to a certain extent. And like also there's layers to it, right? Like because I think there's one thing of like their understanding of like sexuality, of like being gay, and so like me being a side male of birth, and like my sexual attraction to men. So that's one layer of coming out of like I'm gay, and then like, oh, I'm queer, oh, and I'm trans, and there's the different layers of their understanding of what that looks like. And then also I feel like growing up as a trans person, and like with my own like body dysmorphia and stuff, like I've always felt like I like didn't really identify as a man, honestly, like growing up. And so I feel like I always equated that to like, oh, so if I'm not a man and I have like all these feelings about like what my body looks like and stuff, right? Like, and so, oh, that means I'm a woman, because I've always like also internalized the binary of like, okay, so if you're not a man, you're a woman. So I like, for a big portion of like my, explore my gender exploration, I thought that like I was going to transition, right? And then maybe, and I'll still get to that point, I'm still like, continuously exploring that. And then it wasn't until like my junior year of undergrad at college when I started transitioning from using he, him to they, them, and like realizing, oh, actually, like I don't have to be just the other way, I could be both, I could be neither, I could be. And so again, like layers of having that conversation with your family is so complicated, where they can barely like kind of like see like, oh, like understand that like, oh wow, you're attracted to men, what?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so right, like that conversation, and like while like there's layers to that, and I'm still continuing to peel layers of like who I am as a person, and my like how I show up, my gender identity expression, and like how I dress up, how I present myself in certain communities, how that continuously to always change and be fluid. Whole other conversation, but yeah, there's like really layers to that. And I think right, and the ways in which, and I feel like too, like with my family, I know that and like growing up, like I feel like my I would consider myself, like growing up, my parents to be like fairly strict about like how they let me go out and how they let me do certain things, like typical Filipino parents. But I feel like after I went graduated college and like kind of did my own thing, I'm financially supporting my own self. They've been able to really be like free to just like kind of let me do whatever I want. And so I think I realized that change, like when they know that I can support myself. And a lot of that too is right, like our parents are also scared to like, they don't, because a lot of times they really don't know how to support us. They don't know, and they know that a lot of like being queer and trans, there's a lot of violence that comes with that. And so they like don't they and ultimately like they want us to be safe. They want us to make sure that like we can access the same ways in which they were able to. And so right, like having, and like maybe having, starting the conversation from there, that like, yeah, hey, it's okay, like life is gonna be hard anyway, whether I'm cis straight or not. Right. And then like, yes, it adds a layer of marginality, but I think right, like having that conversation of like, oh well, but for me personally, I have the privilege that I've been able to like get a master's in education, and like have full-time job with insurance that like I can support myself. And so like if like I have formed my own sense of community and like my safety and around that. And so because ultimately, right, like our parents just also want the what's best for us, and understanding again like where they're coming from, and like again, and like adding the layer of like the immigrant background of like they moved here for survival, and they want us to move, and in a way like I'm living the American dream of like being able to like like I feel like I can like start building generational wealth, like starting from me, and like like kind of like unpacking and like really breaking the generational trauma of like poverty as well. And so there's layers and layers to like that conversation with our family. And yeah, and then and like and like I'm saying all of that, it's not like, oh yeah, I think my parents will be okay if I come out, and I still haven't done it, right? Because it's again takes a lot of emotional toll to have that conversation. And I feel like I'm always psych myself in terms of like, oh, you know what, like I'm gonna tell them like when I'm really really successful, and I have like maybe like I get my PhD, I have like stable partner, I have my own house, and be like, see, I'm okay and I'm living my best life and I am me. But right, and then there's a lot of complication with that too. And so, and I feel like that's always like, oh my god, that's how I'm gonna come out. Or maybe they'll just watch this podcast and they'll know. And so yeah,
Well, if you get tagged, then good luck on that conversation. But it is a very emotionally tolling process that a lot of people who aren't in the community don't even realize, like, because I feel like it's one of those things where like, I don't know, it's like, Bradley, did you ever feel the need to like come out as straight to anyone ever?
Nope. That is a privilege that I have.
And that, yeah, but
must be nice. Yeah.
But yeah, there are certain things that allies can do. Like, what can we do what can people do as allies to help support us? And are there any resources that you would like to share with us for anyone who are in the LGBTQIA community or anything? Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, I want to unpack the word ally. And in a lot of spaces, people think that LGBTQIA stands for ally. It's not. I know a lot of Target ads think it's that way, like corporate ads. But A stands for asexual. So that's first disclaimer. And secondly, unpacking the word ally in terms of right, like, and who can claim themselves as ally. I feel like allyship really, again, like you don't label someone as ally, or you don't label yourself as one, right? Like, because I feel like a lot of the allyship work, again, right, like how you show up in communities. And I think more specifically, right, again, like with a lot of of things that are happening against like the legislation against trans youth, and like so like making sure that like you're you're continuing to leverage and champion those conversations, and centering trans people in that, and like you're supporting and calling your own legislators to stop that bill and stuff like that. And so like there are more tangible ways for the community to have that conversation. And again, like I said earlier, it really starts like in different community spaces, like you like as a cis hetero person, like introducing your pronouns, like so then like you can have that conversation, you can start to make the LGBTQI plus community to be comfortable to share theirs, so then like others don't have to. And so again, like they don't have to be the first to come out and be like, oh yeah, this is or this is my identity, and like normalizing that in our conversation when we introduce ourselves. And so that's like one very basic thing that we can do. And again, like continue to support like mutual aid efforts that center multiply marginalized communities, and how that supports like also like queer, trans, BIPOC communities. And then I think personally being involved, and I think every communities are different across the country. I don't know per se if I can name like a certain organization nationally that like centers a lot of the conversation. I think there's different ones that like have different focuses. But I know within the Seattle region, we have, the Trans Women of Color Solidarity Network and Queer to Land, who continuously, they're actually having a Pride event today that I'll be attending later. And so I think, continuing to like be involved in different communities in your local network. And I also know that especially for a lot of individuals, that can be a hard process of knowing how to access that. And so like right, especially within like whether that's the ball scene or like just different community organizations that can be involved with, and that really again looks different in different local communities. And so like having to find that and like access that. And so I'm still yet to find like a more accessible way for like different queer, especially queer, trans, BIPOC communities to like again like center us and like for our liberation that works for our liberation. But yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. If you like, it's unfortunately almost time to go. If you just have like some key takeaways you would like any listeners to get like after listening to this podcast, what would you say it is or it would be?
Yeah. Right. Like acknowledging also first that the Filipino LGBTQIA plus identity is so huge and broad that, and like again, a lot of what we've talked about here were based on our own lived experiences, but that doesn't necessarily translate into like what those communities experience in different parts of the country, the world, in the Philippines, in here. And so want to acknowledge that. And right, and like again, the LGBTQI plus identity, and like again, emphasis on the plus, on like how again it continues to evolve, and like does the alphabet soup continues to change, and like people are finding creative ways to identify with themselves. And so recognizing that this is like a spectrum, like continuing to challenge what the binary thinking is, and and again like, and a lot of those things may or may not be like mutually exclusive in like the experience like with each other. And yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Bradley, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. So first of all, I just really want to thank Eric for joining us, as well as Biko for being my co-host. Thank you both for being so vulnerable with your stories. Thank you so much for sharing your story and having the power to share it wholly and say it with your chest in this space. And so we're really thankful for you sharing your stories today. And I love the action steps that you mentioned, Eric, for folks to do, including mutual aid, calling legislators against those, against legislation that is against violence for trans youth, as well as acknowledging for everyone that this language is evolving, and that could be the first step in making sure that you're learning how to center the LGBTQIA plus folks who are close to us and around us, and to make them feel safe in their own skin. So I think that's really important. I love that you brought it up. But with that being said, Our next episode will be episode 6, Importance of Data Disaggregation and Research during COVID-19. And that will be airing on Wednesday, July 14th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. So mark your calendars. In addition, this episode will be also available on Facebook to listen to afterwards if you want to share it with anyone. But yeah, please, if you want to learn more, I just mentioned the Facebook page. Please like us on Facebook. You can find us at, Filipinx, AO, Community Health Association. And then you can also follow us at Fil-XAO _CHA, CHA, to find out more and see how we are continuing to do this work moving forward. So again, thank you to AAPCHO and our funders, the Walmart Foundation, for making this episode possible. And stay tuned for the next one. Thank you, everyone.
Happy Pride.
Happy Pride. Thank you for having me.
Bye.